Hey there, welcome to the Think and Read podcast. I'm Tom Vieira. This is a podcast where we think thinking is worth doing and great books are worth reading. I'm so glad you're here. We are looking at Blaise Pascal's The Pensée. It's a masterpiece that he wrote in the middle of the 1600s. We are in episode 6. If you like what you hear today and want to find more episodes on Blaise Pascal, you can find this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. So let's dive in. The question I want to take up is this. Is there such a thing as non-rational knowledge? Roughly, I think this is the idea that there might be ways of knowing that are not by reason, not by evidence or premises that lead to some conclusion, where so long as I give enough good reason or evidence for those premises, I can therefore prove a conclusion. We call that knowledge. All right, so before we look at what Blaise Pascal has to say about this, his view is really, really interesting. I think we need to acknowledge something, that there's been a lot of buzz among philosophers over the past 100 to 150 years about what knowledge is, and especially about the so-called traditional view of knowledge, which is the justified true belief theory. So let me explain that. The narrative goes something like this. Plato, in dialogues, especially like the Meno, sort of develops this idea of knowledge as justified true belief. Those three things together form the necessary basis or criteria for knowledge. So, in other words, if something is to count as knowledge, that means it's going to be a belief, right? We believe something to be true. That's number one. It's a type of belief. Number two, the belief actually has to be true. And thirdly, we have to have justified reasons, good reasons, for believing it to be true. So if we have all three of those, we have something that we can call knowledge. And so in the dialogue, the Meno, Plato sort of talks about the difference between knowledge and true opinions. Sort of shows that knowledge is something greater. It's more fine. It's more desirable than just having true opinions. He gives us a really interesting example about traveling to a town. So I'll just modify it, apply it to, let's say I'm trying to travel to St. Louis. And he says, okay, well, let's say I've never been there before, but I have good directions. The directions that I have are reliable. If I followed them, I would get to St. Louis. Okay, and so insofar as all that I'm doing is following these directions, I would be fine. It doesn't matter if I've never been there before. I would be fine. But the problem comes when somebody else comes along and says, hey, where are you going? And I'm going to St. Louis. Okay, let me see your directions. Have you ever been there before? No, I've never been there, but I have these directions. He says, oh, no, those are not good directions. Here, let me give you accurate directions. Those directions will lead you somewhere else. Let me give you some accurate directions. We can start to see the problem. Because I've never been to St. Louis, because I don't have a justified true belief regarding where St. Louis is, I can't really tell the difference between the set of directions that are good directions and the ones that are bad. And so what I need is actual knowledge of where St. Louis is, not just a true opinion about how to get there. Okay? And so I'm not going to dive into any sort of the critiques that have been raised about this idea of justified true belief. But let me point out what I think is a problem in the narrative. The narrative sort of, it wants us to think that somewhere all along the way until somewhere in the 20th century, we had this justified true belief, sometimes just called JTB, theory of knowledge. And then about 100 years ago, we sort of said, there's problems with that idea. But if we look more closely, and I'm thinking of Blaise Pascal as one example, if we look more closely at the sort of conversation, the philosophical conversation that has gone on since Plato. I mean, even Plato himself, in one of his dialogues, seems to sort of not accept this JTB theory of knowledge. But if we look more closely at the conversation, we'll see that there have been philosophers who seem to articulate different ideas of knowledge, that sure, there's something called justified true belief, or that, we can say that's sort of one way to think about knowledge, but it's not the only way. Blaise Pascal will say that we can know things not just by way of reason, but also by way of the heart. Probably his most quoted passage is that the heart has its reasons, of which reason knows nothing. I'll come back to that in a moment, because it's the most quoted and it's the most misunderstood of anything that Pascal ever said. But first, as we now take up Pascal and what he had to say about knowledge, and particularly non-rational knowledge, let's first situate him. Okay, so Pascal saw himself as holding a kind of middle ground between two extremes. The extremes of skepticism on the one hand, which says we can't really know anything at all, and rationalism on the other hand, which says that we got to reject everything except that which we can prove with a kind of mathematical-like certainty. Okay, and so on the skepticism side, he certainly has in mind philosophers like Michel de Montaigne, and later on, past Pascal's time, in the 18th century, we'll get David Hume, who's another kind of skeptic. And both Montaigne and Hume seem to really like a more ancient form of skepticism known as Pyrrhonian skepticism. And the primary philosopher there is a guy named Sextus Empiricus. Basically, the idea is that we can't know anything. We have a lot in our minds that we think is knowledge that is basically just custom or habit, things that we have kind of picked up by chance, the chance that I was born in this particular century, in this particular culture, and so on. And had I been, born at a different time in history and in a different place and a different culture, I would have had different customs and habits, and I would have thought those things were things that I knew or knowledge, right? But they're just sort of accidents, circumstantial, accidental facts about my life. It's not really knowledge. When it comes to knowledge, there's no such thing. Skeptics like to use an argument that runs sort of like this: that look, if we take any argument, it's got premises with a conclusion, right? So how do I prove that? Well, if it's a valid argument form, then what I got to do is show that the premises are true, right? And then if I show the premises are true, then I just prove the conclusion, right? There we go. That's reason, which gives me knowledge. But the problem with that is, in order to show that the premises are true, I need to give other arguments to prove those premises. But those arguments themselves have premises which need to be shown to be true with yet more arguments. And so I just kind of go on back forever, never really proving anything, because I'm always having to try to prove premises. It's a little bit like the way terms work. To define a term, I've got to use other terms, which themselves need to be defined by yet other terms. And it's this kind of circularity, this sort of endless searching and never getting anywhere. It's exactly the sort of thing that skeptics love to point out. Pascal's not all that impressed. Pascal said this is an excessive position. It's sort of absurd. Really, it's a position that refuses to trust anything. If we're going to have knowledge about anything, we have to begin with some sort of trust in certain starting points, and that's where the heart is going to come in for Pascal. More on that in just a moment, but let me go over to the other extreme. So we had Pascal kind of in the middle ground between skepticism on one hand, and now let's look at rationalism on the other. He certainly has Descartes in mind here, but there are others as well. And so this idea, he says, is to exclude everything except reason. And so this idea that we can't really accept anything unless we have proved it with absolute mathematical-like certainty. And so we doubt everything until we can find that sort of thing. Descartes' cogito, right, which I've sort of brought up in previous episodes. So in Pulse 183, Pascal writes two excesses: to exclude reason and to admit nothing but reason. To admit nothing but reason reminds quite a bit of, sounds almost exactly like something G.K. Chesterton said about the madman in his book Orthodoxy. He wrote that the madman is not somebody who's lost his reason, but rather somebody who's lost everything except his reason. So interesting connection there. In any case, so Pascal says, look, let's go neither to that one extreme nor to the other. He really sees himself, I think, as trying to hold a position of kind of epistemological sanity here. What's the most reasonable position we can hold? It's a position where we need to trust certain things, and it's upon that foundation of trust, things that we can know by way of the heart, not by way of reason, that we can then go on to demonstrate in meaningful ways things that we can know about the world. Okay, so I think this is a good time to bring up this idea of the heart having its reasons, of which reason knows nothing. Now, I think we have to be really careful. I mentioned that no passage in Pascal has been more misunderstood than this one. Because quite often, there's been books, in fact, a number of books have been written with this title, "The Heart Has Its Reasons," and the idea there seems to be that the heart is sort of an emotional center, right? It has to do with feelings that would lead us in ways that maybe don't make any sense, right? Might even seem a bit crazy, but that's just the heart, and we just sort of follow the heart, kind of the impulses of the heart, that sort of thing. Romantic love is a sort of great way to see how that might work. One of those, at least one of those books has to do exactly with that. The heart is kind of a emotional / romantic sort of center of the human being, and that's really not at all what Pascal has in mind. As I was thinking about this more kind of popular idea of the heart and emotions or feelings, I thought of Return of the Jedi, right? This sort of Star Wars movie. At the very end, the Death Star has been blown up, and it's that scene where Han Solo is trying to comfort Leia, and he says, I don't think Luke was on the Death Star when it blew up. He says something along those lines, right? Anyway, and Leia responds and says, he wasn't. I can feel it, right? Leia gives a very similar type of response when Luke, earlier in the same movie, is telling her that he is her brother, and she says, I know, I've always known. Okay, so it's that idea of the heart. It's sort of this intuitive, emotional thing. So what does Pascal have in mind here? And again, I don't think it's quite the same thing. He does use the word feel. He says at one point that that reason proves where the heart feels. We so there is that term, but again, he doesn't quite mean it in the same way that we would in the 20th and 21st centuries. We get a real clue in Pensée 155. It's a fascinating passage because there's just 3 words there. It's heart, instinct, and principles. Okay, but what is striking about that passage is not so much the 3 words, although they're really important. They give us a clue, but the way in which he wrote them down on paper. They're not listed side by side, but rather vertically. So we have heart on top, and then underneath the word heart we have instinct, and then underneath the word instinct we have principles, as though he is suggesting, just by visually, by the way they're arranged, that whatever we are going to say about the heart is really based on the idea of instinct, which is itself based on the reality of principles. Okay, so he's going to be linking our heart with principles, and there's something instinctual. We might even say intuitive. I think intuition is a good term to use here potentially. Okay, just a clue in that passage. The passage that is most important on this topic is Pensée 110. And again, I am using the Penguin Classics version, which has its own organizational system. In that passage, we read this, and it's a longer passage. I won't read the whole thing. I'll just pull out key aspects of it. We read, "We know the truth not only through our reason, but also through our heart. It is through the latter, that is the heart, that we know first principles." Okay, so I'll pause there even though the sentence continues. The term first principles, I think, is interesting because it's getting at this idea that there are starting points or first things that we can know that become the foundation for all knowledge. And that gets us out of that infinite regression problem that I pointed out from skepticism. Skeptics pointed out that we're always having to go back, forever proving our premises. And Pascal says there's no such problem because there is such a thing as first principles. So when we think about first principles, I could not help but think of Aristotle, for example. A lot of times, we go back to Aristotle, we think about his 10 categories as the sort of starting points for our thinking about all of reality, that anything that exists, which he calls a substance, anything that exists, there's going to be certain fundamental features about it. It's going to have quantity and quality. Let's say I see 4 birds up in this tree. There's a certain number of birds, certain type of birds, right? I can talk about certain type of birds and their relation to one another. There's another category relation, the posture of each bird, and so on. Right? And so for Aristotle, these first principles or the categories are it's sort of the way reality itself is structured. And this is real knowledge. And it's not knowledge that we arrive at by yet more fundamental principles. They are the first principles. Euclid comes to mind as well. We think about Euclid when it comes to mathematical understanding, right? There are starting points for that. You think about Euclid's axioms, definitions, postulates, etc. And from that, we can gain a mathematical understanding of the world. So in any case, first principles is not a new idea, is what I'm trying to say. There's I think Pascal lands himself. How Aristotelian or Euclidean is he here? I'm not sure, to be honest, but I do think that he comes closer to that way of thinking about knowledge, that it's not just discursive. There's an intuitive aspect to knowledge as well, which again raises this question about justified true belief as sort of the only real traditional view on the way knowledge works. It's a more nuanced story than that. So let's go on in this Pensée 110. We read, "For knowledge of first principles, like space, time, motion, and number, is as solid as any derived through reason, and it is on such knowledge coming from the heart and instinct." So there again, he connects heart and instinct with principles. That reason has to depend and base all its argument. Okay, so here he gives examples. And these examples, again, they are fairly similar to what we find in Aristotle. First principles are space, time, motion, number. Might throw in there cause and effect. I don't know. Okay, and he says that the heart feels that there are 3 spatial dimensions. In that passage, he says that. The heart sort of senses that. We know that. We know that intuitively, that as we experience the world is structured this way. There's an implicit trust, in other words, that Pascal wants us to have in our experience of the world. We don't need to doubt that. We don't need to doubt that there's such a thing as time. We don't need to doubt that there's such a thing as 3 dimensions and that there's a numerical aspect to reality. These are things that we trust. And if we doubt those things, that's a pathway to insanity. It's like, well, by what principles then are we going to go if we're going to say we know anything at all? Okay, we don't need to go there. Interestingly, I think we can connect this. I want to do this very briefly because the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who comes late in the 1700s, he died in the early 1800s. You can't but think of Kant when we're talking about this because, so again, for Pascal, when I intuit these first principles, I have a real knowledge about the way the world works. But for Immanuel Kant, he's going to really be the critical philosopher right at the end of the Enlightenment that says, look, space and time and cause and effect, these things, these what you have there are not features of reality itself, but only features of your own experience of reality. So he drives this wedge between how we experience reality and reality itself. It's an unbridgeable gap, in fact. And so with Immanuel Kant comes a kind of irreversible subjectivity that there is no way out of the world of our own experience. There's no access to reality itself. Pascal would fundamentally disagree with that. Pascal would stand in the traditional view of knowledge that says that our experience of the world is real knowledge. It's a knowledge of the way the world itself works, and it's an absurdity to sort of demand a kind of prior proof of those first principles. These are the right starting points. Okay, and in fact, I think Pascal would even say something like this, that to give any kind of meaningful proof, you're going to have starting points, right? So to give any kind of meaningful proof, you're going to have to already accept or perform an act of faith. Knowledge is always going to start with trust, in other words, for Pascal. And so his view on knowledge is quite interesting, right? We didn't really connect this with God. He will do that, of course, in his famous passage on the wager, where he says that we know God by way of the heart and not by way of reason. And so we now have from this episode at least a decent starting point for understanding what it means to know God and why Pascal takes the approach he does in the wager. I'll take that up in the next episode. We'll leave it here for this one. I'm so glad you joined me. Our question is to think or not to think. I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.